Hi, I'm Femi OK.
And I'm Omar Badar, and you're in the stream.
Today, what's it like to live under US sanctions in Sudan for nearly 2 decades?
The United States has imposed sweeping new economic sanctions against the government of Sudan because of its continued sponsorship of international terror, its effort to destabilize neighboring countries, and its abysmal record on human rights, including religious persecution.
The Department of Treasury is tightening U.S. economic sanctions on Sudan. With this new effort, the United States will more aggressively enforce existing sanctions against Sudan's government.
The target of these sanctions is the government of President Omar al-Bashir. The US calls Bashir's government a state sponsor of terrorism, and the International Criminal Court has indicted him for genocide in Darfur. But a recent Twitter conversation shows how Sudanese civilians are paying a very heavy price.
You know, under the hashtag Sudan under sanction, young Sudanese discuss life on the U.S. blacklist. Now, they report problems with basic tasks that many of us take for granted, from booking travel to sending money to enrolling in classes and even downloading phone apps. Now, they post screenshots of the blocked websites that they can't visit.
The US currently sanctions around about 28 countries, but Sudan is in a small category of those under a comprehensive embargo. This has hurt Sudan's economy, health sector and infrastructure. Despite exemptions from humanitarian needs and easing of some restrictions, critics say that Sudanese civilians, not the government, are the worst hit. The UN Special Rapporteur responsible for investigating harmful sanctions, Idris Dazari, is among those voices.
In the case of Sudan, there is considerable collateral damage on the population out there that has nothing to do with the differences, the political differences between their political leadership and that of other countries.
Joining us to talk about the role of sanctions, we have Omar Ismail. He is a senior advisor for the Enough Project. Ahmed Almatada is a telecom engineer in Khartoum, Sudan. Nejwa Konda is a human rights activist from the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. She's in Nairobi, Kenya. And Ibrahim Wade is a Tufts University professor and author of The Price of Fear, The Truth Behind the Financial War on Terror. He's in Boston, Massachusetts. Good to have you here, everybody. Omar, you must have seen the Sudan under sanction complaints. When you see that list of, this is how my life is terrible, this is how it makes life very difficult for me in Sudan, what's your response?
My response is that sanctions are deplorable. But let us remember that sanctions are tools, they are not a policy. And so with the government of Sudan trying to say that the sanctions hurt the country, there is a misinformation here. Because when you are a country that designates 70% of its budget for security and armed services sector, and then you have 7% only of your budget for health, education and services combined. And just recently, last month, in the celebration of the armed forces, in the headquarters of the armed forces, the president said, if we designated 100% of the Sudanese budget to the armed forces and security forces, that is not going to be enough. So that is a country that is reckless. It is the economic woes of Sudan were of the making of the government of Sudan. Yes, the sanctions might have hurt some sectors in Sudan, might have hurt some people in Sudan, but you cannot place the biggest blame on sanctions. The biggest blame is on the government of Sudan and its reckless behavior and bad policies.
All right, so Omar, I'm going to get you to talk to Omar. Give him some of those examples. I want him to answer back to some of these people.
So we do have people who are talking about basically what their experiences are like Ahmed over here, who says, working for an international company and I can't get trained because of the sanctions, transfer my salary and can't get company paid tickets. And we have Neda over here who says, why should citizens suffer? I was part of the Ebola response with an NGO and my salary got blocked for 3 months because I am Sudanese.
I'm a Sudanese as well, and my heart goes out to these people. And I admitted in the beginning that sanctions hurt certain sections, but the blame was not on the sanctions regime. It is on the government of Sudan and its behavior. So we will, all of us should call on lifting the general sanctions. But we can make sanctions effective, And these are the smart targeted sanctions that are going to target individuals and entities that are breaking the law, and they are working to make Sudan is still a country that is on war against itself. So these are the sanctions that we want to see staying. The sanctions that are going to hurt people like Ahmed and Nada and the other average Sudanese person should be lifted, and these are the general sanctions. We don't need them, and in fact we have to enforce the targeted sanctions that are more effective and working, and we can give more examples from around the world, like in Iran and in Cuba, where the sanctions work to change the behavior of this country.
Let me just check in with Ahmed. Ahmed, what year were you born?
In Khartoum.
Yeah, because do you remember that little clip that we showed from Madeleine Albright in 1997? When were you born?
Yeah.
Sanctions in 1997 for Sudan.
Yes.
I'm just
like
wondering
7.
about how long have you lived under sanctions?
I have been born in 91.
Uh-huh.
So almost all my life have been inside the sanction.
Your entire life. What is that? You don't know life before sanctions, life after sanctions. Not really. You don't remember much of that. Give us a little idea about what it's like right now for you. How do you feel the imposition of sanctions right now?
Well, when it comes to sanctions, basically I work in the technology field, so almost all the technology field is related to United States sanction. You just cannot do IT work or telecom work without the need of the United States, the technology, the cutting edge, and everything. And the sanction itself not only affecting the technology field directly, it even affecting in an indirect way the medicine, the health, the education, and every single thing in our life. When we talk about there is no payment systems in Sudan, you cannot transfer banks, you cannot get access to free online educations, you cannot even get grants from outside Sudan. If you have a non-profit project, if you have any organization you work for that work as a social enterprise, you cannot get all these funds. There is a lot of problems you cannot actually use from sanction. And at the end, who is getting the worst of it is the normal Sudanese local citizens, the ones who cannot afford to go outside Sudan to get treatment, health treatment, and better education.
So Ibrahim, when these sanctions were being thought up, did they think about people like Ibrahim? Did they, Ahmed, excuse me, did they think about students trying to study, students trying to get online? Did they think about the fallout from the sanctions?
Not really, because I think that to understand the sanctions system, we should keep in mind a couple of things. One is that sanctions are good politics, but bad policy. And what I mean by that is that there are very obvious political reasons why sanctions are imposed. Most politicians tend to agree that certain countries ought to be sanctioned. But as far as policy is concerned, there's a disconnect with the underlying politics, very simply because sanctions tend to be a blunt instrument. So it is one thing to say that a country is misbehaving and ought to be punished for it, which is the justification for sanctions. But when it comes to the execution of the sanctions, then we can see that sanctions tend to create a lot of collateral damage, in that typically regular people suffer from sanctions, whereas those governments that are supposed to be the bad guys often thrive on sanctions, both politically, because they can blame all of the ills of society on sanctions precisely.
And the other side of that, Ibrahim, is that we're actually getting people on that political capitalization on sanctions. We have Mihad, who tweeted in saying, the most worthless achievements by the regime are now marketed as miracles locally thanks to the sanctions. So, Najwa, do you sometimes see that sanctions could actually end up playing into the hands of the government?
Yes, actually, I would like to say that sanctions are the only international recognition to the misbehavior of the government of Sudan. especially towards Nuba Mountains and southern Blue Nile. And the sanction came actually because the government of Sudan was supporting international terrorism, and it was waging war against its own people, killing people by dropping anti-tank bombs and killing. Even in April this year, 5 schools have been bombed by anti-tank jet fighters from the government of Sudan. It's bombing its own people, and that's why the US is not willing to uplift that government. And I would like to tell my brother Ahmed there that if sanction is affecting you in your personal life, let us put our hand together and put pressure on the government of Sudan to behave and become responsible, protect its own people rather than bombing them and killing them. And in that, when they change their behavior, this is when we all together come and call US and the international community to lift those sanctions.
Ame?
Yeah. Well, I just want to add a small comment is, yes, I understand what you say, but at the same time, there is not only affecting me personally, forget about me, there is, if you are talking about hospitals and people who want to get treatment, the existence of sanction denying them from exporting and re-exporting those medicines or even machines that used to be to help people. So actually there is also people die here. Yeah, it's not the same case, but it's still, people is still dying from unavailability to get the treatment and so. And there is a lot of examples for people, a lot of people died for the same principles.
Let me just drop this in because Nedra mentioned a conflict that's not very well covered. You can look at it here on my laptop. This headline comes from The Guardian. The world turns a blind eye to the people of Sudan's Nuba Mountains. Khartoum is attacking its own civilians. Let me give you one more headline. The worst atrocity you've never heard of. Omar, this is not well known, but Nedra is saying that this is a reason, an argument to keep sanctions in place. This was not the original reason for the sanctions to be imposed on Sudan. Do you think it's a reasonable reason for them to stay?
Well, it is not the original reason if you look at Madame Albright talking about this in 1996. But when you see former President George W. Bush saying, we added more sanctions, and that is when the designation of sanctions came to Sudan and added more of sanctions because of the Darfur Peace Act and what happened in the region of Darfur, which the government of the United States deemed genocide. Let us look at the behavior of the government of Sudan, like Nedra was saying. Sanctions does not drop bombs in people in the Nuba Mountains. Sanctions is not waging war in Darfur. 70% of the Sudanese budget is designated to building the armed forces and security and bringing arms and killing the government of Sudan, killing its own people. Maybe there are people in Khartoum who are not getting some equipment for hospitals. That is not the sanctions. It is the government of Sudan which putting less than 3% of its budget for health. But also, we can look at what happened in lifting some of these sanctions. Sanctions on technology has been lifted already. Sanctions on health is lifted. I was involved in a case where General Motors or General Electric sent a team to Sudan and spare parts to work in a hospital in Sudan. So these are exempted sanctions. So what we can do with the sanction regime is to lift the general sanctions that are hurting the sectors of agriculture, education, transportation, and those sanctions that are hurting the people, and put in place, or actually making the sanctions work against those companies and individuals that are breaking the law.
But let me just have you react to what Al-Bakir over here says. He says the important question here is, if the sanctions are lifted tomorrow, are they going to improve the living standard of ordinary Sudanese, or is it going to strengthen the security sector and impact negatively and have a negative impact on the population? Now the question is, if sanctions are lifted, could the human rights situation get worse? Essentially would imply that it has improved somehow under the sanctions. Do you think the sanctions so far have had any positive impact in terms of how it affects the government's behavior towards the people?
The positive impact is that it kept the government under check. The government of Sudan is worried about the sanctions. They were impervious to sanctions in the beginning, and they are talking about lifting the embargo on certain things. However, they are focusing on the debt relief, of Sudan's debt, which reached about 50 billion with a B, $50 billion at this point. And that is all because of this government and its policies. So the sanctions kept the government under check. And the sanctions kept the government understanding that they cannot misbehave on this way, and the world is going to just give them a blank check to do whatever they want to do in the country, and killing people and destroying the livelihood of the Sudanese people. So in that sense, sanctions work. We will make it work better if we are going to target these companies that are actually owned by the cronies of the regime, the companies that are owned by the national intelligence services, the companies that are owned by the armed forces. So these are the ones that are breaking the law. They are very good companies in Sudan. They are not tied to the regime. They are working hard in innocent ways. Those are supposed to be
there are ways
rewarded.
to work around the sanctions. Ibrahim, let me show you something here. This is a VPN comment from Yasser El Hadi. He says in this tweet, VPN is being a lifestyle. Hashtag Sudan under sanctions. Workarounds perhaps defeat the whole point of sanctions. Is that a weakness of them being applied to countries?
Well, I think this does illustrate a point I was making earlier, which is it's one thing to look at sanctions in theory. It's another to look at the sanctions in practice, because what happens in reality, and this is true of sanctions everywhere, is that those who impose the sanctions tend to insist on the fact that the sanctions are not blunt, and that the sanctions are smart, and that they're targeted. In reality, translating those lofty goals into practice is a different story, because you have bureaucracies that work on precisely making those sanctions more humane.
Ibrahim, can you give us an example
if you look
of
at
that?
different cases
all
over the world, you realize that it's a very, very difficult job to do, to try and humanize those sanctions.
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, again, most of my work is on the financial aspects of the war on terror. And I've been following that for many, many years. Every time you look at the proclaimed goals of sanctions, it's hard to disagree with the need to keep certain governments under check. If you want to look at the actual outcome, there have been a few examples a few days ago. For example, we've heard about some nuclear essays by North Korea, despite a very extensive set of sanctions against the country. We've seen in the case of Cuba a statement by the Foreign Affairs Minister of Cuba saying that sanctions that were actually recently lifted still cost something like $5 billion to the economy. So it is a very difficult exercise to have a system of smart and targeted and humane sanctions.
So
Yes,
we got a video comment actually online here from Mahmoud in Sudan. I would like you to check it out, Najwa, and then react to it.
Of course, the Sudanese government is an illegitimate government with well-known human rights violations history, and in a sense it deserves to be punished from the international community. At the same time, I don't see the current international community as the suitable agency to pressure third world countries like Sudan, because international relations depends only on power politics without any sense of democratic representation for third world people. So I'm against the sanctions because United States and its allies always put the human rights mask to cover their narrow national interests.
So Najwa, Mahmoud seems to be getting at the fact that the sanctions tend to apply to countries that the US doesn't like, and then that there's not consistency in the way that they're being applied. Does that bother you, or do you look at the case of Sudan in isolation? Najwa, that's for you.
Actually, that's not true because, that's not true because actually Sudan, for every Sudanese who live in Sudan knows exactly the atrocities that the government of Sudan are committing against their own people. And then also, Sudan has been hosting international terrorists, and therefore the sanctions are very legitimate to the government of Sudan, so they can look into themselves and change the behavior first of all, stopping the atrocities that they are committing against their people. And then for those people who said sanctions are affecting education and health, I don't know how, because me, myself, I was in the UK in 2007 to do my master's degree. And I met there many of my country fellows who are also studying in various levels of education in the UK and also everywhere else. My mother also visa from Khartoum and came to Nairobi for treatment. So I don't understand how they're saying it's also affecting health. And as Omar said, actually health, education, and other sectors are those who are being not under sanction, because I did not see any institution, health institution or education institution working with Sudan and have been trialed. I know the banks that have been trialed. I know also oil companies that have been trialed because they have been working with Sudan in financial issues. But any education or health work that have been done with Sudan, with other companies from outside Sudan, has not been sanctioned.
Okay, so here's the thing, Guess. Moving forward, if you move forward from the last 20 years, Omar, you were saying at least the sanctions have been a check on the Sudanese government, the Sudanese regime, administration. How do you get out of that situation? I mean, the whole idea of sanctions is that the behavior changes.
Exactly.
How do you move on?
It is very hard for the government of Sudan to change its behavior after 27 years plus in power. However, they now feel the crunch of these sanctions and also of the debt that are suffering under.
How do you know they feel the crunch?
Because they aggressively are going out there to lift the sanctions. They had all the diplomatic push that they can muster, and they try to convince the European countries and the United States to lift the sanctions. The diplomatic push of the Sudanese government actually bordering the line of blackmail and is really aggressive. They are trying hard because they felt the crunch. They cannot transfer money out of Sudan. They cannot bring foreign direct investment into the Sudan in certain sectors, in dual use of high-powered computers, for example. They cannot get that. They cannot get certain technologies. So they are suffering from these sanctions. However, remains to be seen whether they are going to change their behavior or not. If there is a clear path...
Remains to be seen means I don't know. Ahmed.
I really don't know.
Yeah, you don't know. Yes. Remains to be seen. I don't know. Ahmed, do you know?
Yes, I want to have a small comment that you just mentioned the targeting sanction concept, and just to reply for the other comments that just mentioned. Yes, you can have some exemptions for health and for education to get equipment or to get some things inside Sudan. And that is because after you get a license for the OFAC, and which is a very long process that may take a lot of effort, a lot of time and money. And just to give you a small picture about how actually the sanction is affecting the normal Sudanese people, I will give you
Ahmed, we have 1 minute. It's going to be a very short story. So tell me one example and then we'll wrap up the show.
Yes, this example that the sanction itself on the Sudanese it looks as a curse. They cannot take exam. A friend of mine and someone I know, he studied in one of the university in the United States, and he got into a long process getting into
and then what happened to him? What happened to him?
Intel.
A very long process, and then what happened to him?
Yeah, a long process with Intel, and he got into one of Steve Harkin's programs there.
Amazing job, and then what?
Yeah,
and then he was turned down
because of nationality.
Because of his nationality. Okay, that's the tough side of sanctions against Sudan. We will pick up this conversation with all of our guests online on that online post show at stream.aljazeera.com. If you want to add to that conversation, you can. #AJStream. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you online. Hello, welcome back. This is our online post show. We are going to pick up the conversation with our online community and Omar. What do you have?
We have Murtala over here with an interesting suggestion saying U.S. sanctions on the country have not been effective. Dialogue with the Sudanese will provide results. Ibrahim, if I can toss that to you, an argument could be made that in the case of Iran, sanctions could have gone on for a very long time, and it was really the Obama administration's decision to have engagement is what maybe moved the process along. Do you think anything positive could come from talking to the Sudanese government, maybe have better, a quicker impact to what the U.S. is going after?
Absolutely, because in many ways, sanctions can evolve into a no-win game, whereby neither those who impose sanctions get their way, namely either obtaining policy change or regime change. And then if you look on the side of on the receiving end of sanctions, then there's another problem, which is that the country suffers a lot. So neither side tends to benefit. Although there are, one can argue, some bureaucracies that benefit from that, and certain politicians who gain from that. But overall, I think it's a no-win game. Therefore, the alternative of an actual and open debate and discussion between the governments concerned is clearly the best solution.
Ahmed, you know what I noticed is that the two people who are arguing the most vociferously for sanctions on Sudan do not actually live in Sudan. What do you make of that? Do you find that the most vociferous arguers for sanctions are really important, we have to have sanctions in Sudan, do you find that they're living outside of Sudan?
Typically, yes.
Let me ask Ahmed that. Ahmed, what do you think?
Well, possibly, but it's not basically just the situation like that, because there is a lot of condition happening. But the thing that I want to say is we fully understand everyone's concerns, but there is something people need to take into mind. Nowadays, economic is in Sudan, inside Sudan, for people living inside Sudan, is at the worst, and country going from worse to worse. No jobs, nothing. There will not be a country after a few years if things going like this. When small and medium-sized startups cannot function in this country because of lack of payment and infrastructure, when people dying from lack of medicine, when people dying from a lot of things that because they don't have the money or even the privilege to travel outside to get it, which is that elite have those privilege, which is not the case for people who are very normal Sudanese people.
Let me push back on this thing about, the people who are proponents of sanctions are always those people who live outside.
I didn't say always, I just said in this conversation. The two people who are arguing sanctions
we live outside the country.
Very helpful, you live outside the country.
If you go today to the places where myself and Najwa came from, I came from Darfur. Mm-hmm. And if you talk to the almost 3 million people plus that are living in conditions that are subhuman, and if you look at over 1.5 million that in the Nuba Mountains that get their breakfast every day with those barrel bombs that are thrown at them from the high-flying antennas. And if you talk to the people in the Nuba in South Blue Nile, they will tell you the same thing. Mm-hmm. I have no means. I cannot claim that I went there and interviewed all these people, or there was a Gallup poll that. But
what? See, Omar, you make a very good point. Let me just illustrate.
What we did is
this visually. Let me show you this, because I think this is probably a picture's worth 1,000 words. This picture's probably worth 1,000 of your words. Here we are in the Nuba Mountains, and then here we have on the hashtag Sudan under sanction. Let's start with my iPhone. I can't update my application or install a new one. Okay, let me just show you the Nuba Mountain one more time. There you go. And then as someone who studied abroad, I had difficulties paying my application fees. Let me just show you that picture one more time. There you go. Does that back and forth there between the concerns of a part of Sudan society who are wealthy enough, who have access enough to be able to work around the sanctions, not balance up with people who are really suffering?
It will be disingenuous on me to say that only the people who are benefiting from this regime or the affluent people who had, the access are the people who are against sanctions. No, they are people who are against sanctions for different reasons. And we just seen in that video somebody who is worried about the democracy and human rights who is a normal Sudanese to me, who's against sanctions. But the general sense among the people that are suffering because of their suffering that the sanctions were levied on Sudan in the first place, that is the gross violation of human rights, genocide, killing people every day, at will, and lack of any accountability in the country. These are the things that created the original sanctions in the first place. But these conditions still persist. These people is still calling for these sanctions to be in place.
And there are people who don't trust the political motivations of these sanctions, though. So people like Ibrahim here who say these sanctions do not target the Bashir regime. If they did, they would be smart sanctions like they are in South Sudan, not blanket ones. But we kind of have actually another interesting disagreement here with Tom, who says regulated sanctions driven by common sense can affect the government more than the citizens if they are properly executed. But on the other hand,
that is the one that I was calling.
That's right, your idea for it. But we have Walid here who says what hurts the government also hurts the citizens, which I want to toss to you, Ibrahim. Given the fact that the government's main function generally, or ought to be maybe, providing services to the people, how can you really separate those things to have sanctions that hurt the government but don't actually end up having a significant impact on the population?
Well, it's nearly impossible to achieve that. Because one interesting case study, which is probably the longest case of continuous sanctions, was Cuba. And anybody who looks at Cuban politics would have to acknowledge that one reason for the longevity of the regime of the Castro brothers has been precisely those sanctions, because you had somebody to blame. And then there was a new system that appeared that was geared towards navigating around sanctions. And most countries under sanctions are likely to go in that direction. There's another famous case, which is Saddam Hussein's oil for food sanctions program, which benefited the Saddam Hussein regime and clearly hurt the people.
Let me just bring in Nedra here, because we're going to wrap up the conversation. Nedra, I want you to do a little bit of prognostication, a little bit of forecasting here. How long do you think the sanctions against Sudan will be in place? How long do you think they will be necessary for?
Actually, for me, I think as long as Sudan is really not correcting the behavior towards its people and towards the international terrorism in general, the sanctions should not be lifted. Right. Because the clip that you have just shown there, these children, they are not able to go to school. And when they go to school, there is no chalk for the teacher to write on that blackboard for them to read. So they will opt to write on the floor, on the soil, because there is no chalk. Sure. And now, their counterpart or their fellow citizen in Khartoum or in the northern countries, they are talking about renewing their iPhone, they're talking about booking online, they're talking about all these. I think for me, it's like favorable things, but the children in Nuba Mountains are asking and requesting for very basic services, education, for example. Sure. So if these sanctions are lifted today from Sudan, for me, that's my own analysis. I think Sudan will just go ahead and buy more advanced weapons and the Sukhoi and the Antonov to come and drop more bombs and more sophisticated bombs on the people of Nuba Mountains, including the schools, the hospital, and whatever. So for me, I want all the Sudanese, sure, outside Sudan and inside Sudan, in the conflict areas and in Khartoum. Let us put our hands together to put pressure on the government to change the behavior. Respect and protect their own people. Give these basic human rights to their own people. And then we can talk about lifting the sanctions.
So Nedra and Ibrahim and Ahmed and Omar, I really appreciate your perspectives today. They're not all in line. They come from different opinions. And I really appreciate you helping us unpack this idea about sanctions in Sudan. And are they even working? Omar, where do you want to leave us?
I can leave you with this skeptical thought here from Usman Online, who says, only Sudanese people suffer the sanctions. The government members are enjoying their lives normally and happily.
Omar, do you agree?
Well, I agree to a degree that the government of Sudan, they, like Ibrahim said, they find a way around sanctions. However, that does not mean that we are going to lift the sanctions that are hurting the government. I would ask for tightening the sanctions that will hurt the government, lifting the sanctions that are hurting the people. It is hard to separate the two. However, we will find ways if we are looking harder and if we apply the tools that we have.
Thanks to our guests. We appreciate your time. Omar Ishmael and Ahmed Almatada and Ibrahim Wade and Negdwa Konda. Thank you so much for being part of our program today. We really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.